today's opening panel, Grading on a Curb, the state of our streets and cities in 2023. It's been a couple transitional years, and I'm excited to have these following guests talk a little bit about the future of Los Angeles, California transportation. First up, we have Connie Llanos, the general manager of LADOT. We have Jordan Justus, the co-founder and CEO of Automotus. Jean O, the CEO of Tranzito. And Tom Maguire, the streets director of SFMTA. It's our lovely panel. So I want to start out with a question to just sort of the crowd, and we can go from there, see where this conversation takes us. But 3 years into the pandemic, we've sort of hit an idea of the status quo or the new status quo. Some people consider it still a transitional period. Where would you say we're at in terms of transportation, delivery, citywide or statewide, in your case, Tom? What is the new status quo, and what can we expect to see as implemented in the future?
I could jump in.
Yeah, sure.
If this is on. Here. Is it on?
No.
Oh. Hello?
There
All right.
you go.
Well, good morning, everyone. I think we're still very much in a transitional period, at least here in Los Angeles.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that it's been a transition also. The pandemic wasn't equal in the way that it impacted the way people moved in LA. So even at the very peak of the pandemic, we saw some really dramatic differences between how people were behaving in their transportation patterns depending on how affluent the community was, and also the concentration of communities of color. So in our more affluent communities, we definitely saw those drastic decreases in traffic and demand even for public transportation. And then a rapid increase, right, in the deliveries and the like. Whereas in our lower income communities, in some of our bus routes, our neighborhood dash routes, we never lost those drastic numbers of ridership. You know, they dipped a bit, but they held steady. And we actually, in some cases, saw even higher travel demand, as a lot of folks who were coming out of the service industry were then relying on driving as a source of income. You know, and I think now, as things are leveling off for others, I think we'll start to see that sort of rebalancing, right? As the service industry continues to grow, as people start to return into the office. And, you know, we're starting to see semblance of that. You know, our dockless rides are on track actually to be at pre-pandemic 2019 levels this year already, which is it was pretty significant considering how low our ridership got, and even our Dash transit ridership already back to 80% of its pre-pandemic ridership. So that said, I think it's super important, and the conversation we're having here, just because we're starting to see the demand go up, it doesn't mean that it's the same. And I think that as city officials, as the private sector, I think it's incumbent upon us to not lose the opportunity that we have to fundamentally shift the way we do business to really meet today's needs. I don't know what others have to say.
After you, Tom.
You're all looking at me, so I'll jump in with a NorCal or maybe a statewide perspective too. I certainly agree with just about everything Connie said about the differing ways in which people use the transportation system during the pandemic and how we're emerging now. I think in San Francisco, what we see is a robust recovery of travel again in the neighborhoods, but downtown remains 30-40% empty in the office buildings, and we see the exact same numbers in things like our big downtown parking garages. but the parking meters in our neighborhoods, where the restaurants that are depending on the inbound and outbound courier deliveries are full or even more full than they were before the pandemic. So it's an uneven recovery. The problem we have in San Francisco and many big cities is that our transit systems are all about getting people into and out of downtown.
Right.
And so when we think about reimagining transportation in this restoration or in this recovery period, it's got to be about moving people between every neighborhood in the city. And I think that will be it's a bumpy road we're on, but that'll be a much more equitable outcome and a more equitable system that comes out of it.
Yeah, I'll just add that I think what we're seeing is a mental mind shift, right? It was a given, right, that the most valuable piece of real estate in the world, right, is downtown on-street parking spaces, right? And like you said, it's not worth $2 an hour or $3 an hour. It's the most important real estate. And I think with COVID kind of changing patterns, allowing restaurants to use that for pop-ups and everything, we are starting to realize that we can reimagine streets, reimagine the curbs, and it's a great time. But it's also extremely short-lived, right? We're already seeing traffic on highways back to normal. So the busyness on curbs, it's that 1 year, 2 year transition that we have to really change something before it becomes normal again to use it for parking a car, right? So I think it's an interesting time, but it's a very valuable time to use to really shift things permanently before we revert back to normal.
Yeah, and I would just add on that point, we're a curb management company. We work with a lot of cities to help them better understand and manage what's happening on the ground. And what we've seen in the last couple of years, as a lot of you guys have seen, is really growth in commercial vehicle traffic, obviously, which is a large reason why we're all here today. But in a lot of cities that we work with, we see now more than half of on-street parking coming from commercial vehicles, whereas in a lot of cities, I'm sure like LA and San Francisco, you have a very small portion of your total curb allocated for loading and unloading. There's a lot more double parking, and commercial vehicle traffic is growing rampantly year over year. So there's a lot of new opportunities, new challenges, and I know both of these cities are working hard on solving them, as Gene is as well, and tackling a lot of challenges at the curb through bus shelters and creating more dynamic space. But overall, just demand has shifted drastically, and we're seeing that a lot of the new normals that presented as a result of increased e-commerce and on-demand delivery as a result of COVID have stuck around and will likely continue to grow, really.
This is a great jumping off point then for my next question. We're kind of split down the middle here on the panelists between private and public sectors. What can those two communities or groups do to work more efficiently together to create programs around equity and making sure that there's infrastructure in place to keep these communities safe and moving along and rich with commerce and doing well while still helping the underserved communities as well?
Well, I'm glad you asked. So our job as Tranzito, we're transitioning ourselves to become, in essence, a property manager of the curb, right? We believe that the most important thing for cities to realize is that they own it, right? They own the curb, and it is a very generational opportunity where the supply-demand mismatch is only going to be greater, meaning that you have a fixed supply, a finite supply of curb space, and you have an infinite demand for that curb space, as Jordan's business attests to, right? On-demand package delivery is growing. Micromobility is growing. Pickup drop-off is growing. So all of these trends that are VC-backed have an infinite demand for that curb space, and cities are like, yo, you need our space, right? So it's the job, I think, for cities to assert that authority, right? But assert it in a positive way. Instead of cities saying, we own this and we're going to create a transportation operation system and this and that, that's terrible, right? It's instead saying, we're going to be a property owner and we're going to let you, private companies, use our property. But guess what? If you want to use our property, we want to basically make sure that our public policies can be achieved through your vehicles.
Yeah, that's exactly it, right? I do think that the sort of the sweet or the special sauce, right, is when cities and the private sector can really work off of what each other does best, right? And they listen to each other. Because I do agree wholeheartedly. I mean, cities are really, we have we've always sort of wanted to manage our brick and mortar curbside, but more than ever, we're realizing that it may be our most valuable real estate. Right now, as there are so
Literally,
many
yeah.
competing demands on it, right? So I think that, for the partnership to really grow and work, I think the private sector needs to really honor what are the needs of community right now, right? How can they help us solve for the sustainability challenges that we all should care about, right, as a society? How can they help us realize our inherent equity goals, right? Making it easier for people to use a curb space to actually get their core needs met, right? Getting to and from, healthcare, education, how people access even food, healthy foods, right? I think it's really critical that we honor each other's, best skills. And for us, I think it really is about the exploration that partnership can provide as well. I completely agree that we have sort of a window of time to really seize on to ensure that the pandemic doesn't come and go without us having learned some critical lessons. Now's the time. And I'm always excited when private sector companies come in, really listening, right? We've all got strategic plans. We're all out there talking about the policy goals that matter most to us. So go out there, use your resources, use that VC funding, and come back to us with some real ideas about how you solve our problems, not just how you sort of create more revenue.
And I'm sorry, I'm going to jump in real quick because here's where the VC money intersects with equity, right? So you look at what's going on, what's recovered quickly. Ubers have recovered, Lyft has recovered, right? Micromobility has recovered, Amazon package delivery has recovered. That's all upper middle class commerce going on, right? Transportation, all upper middle class. And how does that affect the poor person? Well, the average Metro bus rider, their household income is $19,000. Can you imagine living at under $19,000 in this city? Now imagine an entire household living that amount, right? They're taking the bus. That's the right-hand lane. That's the exact same lane that these Ubers and Lyfts and Amazons double park. Now all of a sudden, if I'm taking a bus, I could lose my job because now I'm unexpectedly half an hour late, right? We talk about homeless issues. We're not looking at the people that are a week away, a paycheck away from being homeless. So these people who are taking the bus are paycheck to paycheck. Now they lose their job because an Uber is on that right-hand lane. Now all of a sudden, you have that negative cycle that goes on, right? So this is the intersection. And this is why, companies like, Jordan's company, if we're monitoring that curb, we're making sure that these companies who are using public, basically resources and never paying their fair share, by having them pay their fair share, now Connie could say, great, if you want to use our curb, now you have to give us a low-income fare transfer for a scooter. Otherwise, you don't get to use the curb, right? If you want to use our power that's next to the curb, you've got to give us a discount program. So then that becomes basically a win-win for everyone. It's not a stick approach, it's a carrot approach. And everyone wins, public and private.
Yeah, and I'm really interested in thinking about how to come down from the big policy goals. I think all of us do share these big policy goals around equity and sustainability. But what are the standards? What are the working relationships between the public and private sector? Those have historically been very hard to actually implement in real life. We often do it through these fairly clunky permitting programs. I'm very excited about building out things like the digitization of our curb regulations. If you haven't done so already, check out the OMF's curb data standard. I think that is my plug there. That is very much the future of where we're going. And of course, cities are doing things like automating their enforcement, putting things onto license plate recognition, moving their parking meters to pay by plate. So those are all the building blocks of an ecosystem where the private sector can come in and bring solutions that allow us to price curbs properly and that allow us to give discounts and equity programs on top of that. But if you don't have the infrastructure in place, we're not going to be able to do that at scale. And that's my real message.
Yeah, completely agreed. And I would just again echo Connie's points. I mean, you have to, from what we've seen, I think we've all seen how micromobility industry has really played out here in LA, where there's a lot of, and similar with TNCs, where you show up, you say this is how things work now, ask for forgiveness, and Some of that goes better than others, but overall, it hasn't been effective in really solving the key transportation problems that the city of LA and other cities face. And so sitting down in a room, trying to figure out that Venn diagram of where do our strategic goals align and what's the lowest hanging fruit that we can tackle today to solve a real problem for our constituents. And then maybe there's a phase 2, a phase 3, once we figure out what the lowest common denominator is that we can address. But it's really about figuring out what those common goals are and starting there, because I think sometimes we maybe start off on the wrong foot, and then you end up in these adversarial relationships where you're not only not solving problems, but creating problems in a lot of ways.
Yeah, to just jump in with a final thought, and I think what you said really does segue Tom's point, right? I think the magic of organizations like the Open Mobility Foundation is that it brings public and private sector together to a table where we're really rolling up our sleeves and figuring out how we actually make things work, where the rubber meets the road, to use an obvious. But it's true, right? I think that the days where cities and the private sector were opposing each other really should be behind us, because we're all interested in creating transportation that is more seamless for everyone. We might have an inherent goal to focus in on the folks who don't drive profit. But I think in doing that, right, when we create a system that works for those individuals, our bus riders who rely on public transportation, we're actually improving the system for everyone across the board. And I think that's a real important takeaway.
That actually, brings me to my next point. And I think this is hopefully for the entire group, but technology as it exists right now has taken a little bit of a hit just in terms of the financial sector of it. But the uses and the implications of what new and emerging tech can do is huge and vast, and kind of like hits every policy, hits every group, every organization, every part of government. So I guess my question to you is, how much of these new programs rely on new tech, such as being developed by companies such as like data management, data collection, digital advertising, electric vehicles, and what are the both pain points and what are the successes that you guys have noticed so far working with new technology?
Well, I will say that I think because of where the tech industry is today, I also think it's sort of a necessity, a business necessity, to end the days of these prolonged sort of battles, city to city, marketplace to marketplace. Having a system that creates some consistency across the board for the businesses will, in the end, actually give them a better return on investment on a lot of these technologies. But
I mean, I would say, when I look at technology, it's interesting because we're talking about a digital, scalable world with a finite physical environment, right? And then you have, of course, the public safety environment on top of that. And that's where it's been really tough for technology to really hit the public sector and, public streets so well, right? But when it comes to where that's going to hit, it's all about optimization. Like, can we utilize the same finite resource and optimize it? So, for example, we were just talking about this before the conference. I mean, look at bus stops, right? Bus stops are the perfect network for mobility hubs, right? If you're talking about mobility hubs, what has great sighting? What has great network? What has great visibility and awareness, especially of the lower income community? It's bus stops, right? Well, it's underutilized 95% of the time, right? The problem, though, is that in that 5% where buses are, you better not have a vehicle there. Otherwise, you're screwing everything up, right? So technology can absolutely optimize that, right? If you have real-time bus information, then now the Ubers and Lyfts know when they can go in that space. Now a delivery vehicle perhaps can know when they can go in that space. Then you co-locate a package delivery system there. Now UPSs don't have to go 15 routes. They go to one route and drop all 15 packages, right? That then creates the ability for someone taking the bus to pick up a package on their way home, right? And now all of a sudden, DOT can say, you can now, not as a stick, not park here, but as a carrot, you can park there, right? That frees up the right-hand lane, which makes buses flow smoother. There's incremental revenue being made. Everyone wins, right? So that optimization can only happen with technology. Basically, again, taking a finite resources, but stacking benefits on top of a single place.
Yeah, I like the idea of optimization. I think we are in the optimization business because we're not widening our streets, we're not building more roads, we're optimizing what we've got. But I think the real question is, what are we optimizing for, and who are we optimizing for? I definitely like the provocation of using bus stops for more than just buses, but I think in San Francisco we want to, number one, make the bus stop absolutely 100% reliable for the, when a bus is running every 2 or 3 minutes, you really cannot have a vehicle there at all. We also want to optimize for the customer experience. So I'd like every bus customer in San Francisco and LA to have like a dignified experience and not feel like they're sitting in a loading zone, but rather they're sitting in a place where their city's carved out, a nice place for them to wait for the bus, because the bus is the most important, or from our point of view, the most efficient, most important part of the transportation system. So I agree with you very much on the optimization, but who and what we're optimizing for I think that's the live question for us as policymakers.
Yeah, to add to that, I mean, for example, we're just starting working on new bus shelters in LA, right? It's a little known secret that in the last 20 years, about 660 bus shelters were built, right? Out of a network of 8,000 bus stops, right? We don't need to talk about how or why that happened, but this new...
Or maybe we do.
Let's
Where
get
are
into
those bus stops? Where
So-
are those shelters?
I think it's interesting that it was a financial disincentive to build more after 660 bus shelters,
Yep.
right? Financially, you're at a loss. So with this new contract, with the city basically owning this contract and getting now 3 times the amount of revenues, they can dictate where the bus shelters and when they get built, right? So with the new bus shelters, we're going to provide basically the things in technology that people just need. Real-time bus information. When's the bus coming, right? They're going to need city messaging, right? What's the events that are going on relevant to me? They're going to want to know if there's an emergency alert. Like, they want these bus shelters to provide that beacon of information. So these are the basic amenities that we're providing at the bus shelter, so that in essence they become technology hotspots for those that don't have that on their phones.
Tom, I wanted to ask you specifically, there is some differences between San Francisco and Los Angeles.
A few, yes.
A few, yes. But coming from being a New Yorker myself originally, and I'm so used to having mass public transit be through the subway, and just what are some of the plans that you guys have for your transit systems in San Francisco that might differ a little bit from Los Angeles's plans?
Well, San Francisco has, for 40 years, been what we call a transit-first city. So our city charter says that any decision that I make as a transportation policymaker has to consider the transit customer and the transit system first. So I think that does make us different than a lot of cities in the U.S. Where we need to get to is, first of all, restoration of as much of the core. Muni's our main bus operator. MCA runs Muni. As much of the core network as possible. And the unfortunate fact is that, like a lot of operators in California, we do not have the revenue right now to restore 100% of the service that we ran before COVID. And that has to do with the city's tax base. That has to do with the drop of parking revenues, which in San Francisco are used to directly subsidize mass transit. And so with less revenue in place, we're talking about maybe a transit fiscal cliff in 1, 2, 3 years for a lot of agencies around the state. And that means that the direct answer to your question has 2 parts. One is recover as much of that core network as possible, frequency, reliability, especially in the neighborhoods that are so reliant on transit. So it's an equity strategy. But the second piece is to actually figure out, how do we come up with a new financial model for us as a city transportation agency? One of the really interesting things that we're exploring right now is changing some very archaic parking meter rules. The parking meters go off at 6 p.m. in San Francisco, and San Francisco is a great place at night. There's lots of great restaurants to go to, and you can park for free at them. I don't think you should park for free when you go out to spend $300 on a dinner in San Francisco. I think you should pay the meter. And we're also going to try to keep our meters on Sunday as well, which will be a big challenge. That is part of good curb and parking management. It makes sense on its own, but it's also part of an equitable citywide transit recovery strategy.
Maybe we should consider trying to get some smart loading zones out there too, Tom. I'll just add briefly on a separate note, what we've seen elsewhere, kind of off that point, is in a lot of areas where cities are starting to reform their parking rules, their practices around managing and monetizing the curb. They're creating a lot of different enterprise funds for things like mobility wallets in LA, Pittsburgh, for example, did a universal basic mobility program that is now partially funded by some of their smart loading zones. And so just trying to your point, tie all of these new opportunities of revenue generation to some of the core fundamentals of your transportation planning and operations that may have been hit by budget shortfalls and things of that nature. But you all are the experts.
Well, I think that's, again, we keep sort of circling back on the same idea, right? As we come back, how do we come back? How are we funding that comeback? You know, it's clear that the loading zone and the curb is in higher demand. Perhaps in some cases, certainly in San Francisco with that dynamic of losing all that office traffic, right? It's not coming back in the same ways. So how can we offset that, right? And also, how can we not lose sight of the ways in which people are traveling today? I don't know how that transit ridership has impacted you all, but I think, you know, for us watching the dynamic of, again, some of these neighborhood routes really far exceeding pre-pandemic levels today, and contrasting that with, for example, my commuter express, which is still at just over 50% of its ridership pre-pandemic. You know, that is a reality that I need to contend with. How can I then maybe think about leveraging some of the demand on my curb and some of the demand on my transit and really sort of moving revenues around to really feed the kind of transportation we want to see, right? Because I think in the midst of also thinking about how people are traveling out of a pandemic, we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that these sustainability goals that we'd had for ourselves are feel more pressing than ever. And I don't know about you all, but as much as I love electric vehicles, I certainly love mine. The electric vehicle alone is not going to solve our climate challenges.
That's a great point, and I agree with that wholeheartedly. But California is spending a lot of money on its electric vehicles and its chargers, and there's a lot of money in certain parts of transportation being used, and a lot of technology, for instance, like data and market research collection that is necessary to get the information that you need. But at the same time, where can we find a balance between that and the transparency about what's being collected, what are we spending the money on, and how can the public just have the information that is available to the government sectors, I guess?
Well, I can say that one of the things we were talking to legislators in Sacramento about just a few weeks ago with Jeff Tumlin and a collection of other city leaders, we need to be thinking about sort of the incentives that we're putting around electric vehicles and the financial challenges that creates, right? You know, where you have less and less revenue coming in from a gas tax per se, and you're also expending on these incentives for electric vehicles. Where are the incentives for transit ridership? Where are the incentives for e-bikes, right? And other things that ultimately could get us a much greater return on investment that have a series of co-benefits that electric vehicles alone don't provide. I think those are the conversations we need to be having as we as agencies are really thinking about some very serious policy choices we're going to have to make with our public transportation system.
And I would just add, too, to that point, you know, a lot of the electric vehicle subsidies, you know, make a $40,000 car a $32,000 car. You know, not everybody can clearly afford that. And so what are the inequities as well that we're advancing through the types of policies that we're putting out versus supporting more active, sustainable, transit-oriented methods of transportation? And so glad you guys are working on that. I mean, there's a lot of challenges that need to be solved, but there's a lot of historical frameworks that we use to implement these types of subsidies that aren't necessarily beneficial to the vast majority of constituents, obviously.
Yeah, and I think I think we have to be careful about using the right and the wrong incentives. There's, you know, we are often asked, why can't I park my electric vehicle for free at a parking meter? And I say, well, an 8-foot by 22-foot piece of real estate in San Francisco costs the same, no matter how clean the vehicle parked it is. But as Connie said, there are lots of different modes that can fill the gap, and especially in these small local trip making patterns. The vast majority of trips in all of our cities are under 3 miles. So there's lots of ways in which e-bikes and scooters and maybe the way we design streets so people feel a little more comfortable walking and biking, the streets are not so car dominated, can really play a role in the mode shift. Because the mode shift is what is going to really help us make that big leap towards achieving our climate goals. Electrifying the fleet, electrifying all the vehicles that are left after we make a mode shift is great, and we should do it. But we shouldn't misplace our subsidies either.
Sorry, like I want to. Sorry about that. I want to go back one moment though, and sort of push again on this idea of the transparency about what, as we get to be more of a smart city, as we get to know a little bit more about how riders are moving along and who's parking where. How are we going to be transparent about what data is being collected and how we're using that data?
Yeah.
I just want to say one thing about this, because I think this is an interesting, very ironic kind of hot topic, I think, about, let's say, OMF, right? Open Mobility Foundation. For those of you that don't know, it was birthed right here in LA, right, with mobility data specification, became the Open Mobility Foundation. And interestingly enough, the Electronic Frontier Foundation came out against it on behalf of Uber because of data privacy concerns. And I think it's ironic that we're concerned about the public having data to help the public, but we're not concerned about private companies that we willingly give data to basically have no transparency about the data they're collecting in order to optimize rides that are going to be at the detriment of public services like buses. Just saying, right? So, I mean, when we talk about data, I mean, data privacy, of course, is important. And of course, there's always going to be concerns about data, even if you aggregate it or, or whatnot. But let's think about the data and where it's going. It's either going to go in public hands to fight what private hands already have, or it's not. And if we don't give the public the data, we're not helping anyone. Just saying.
Well, preach, Gene. What else do you say to that? Obviously, as cities, as members of the Open Mobility Foundation, we have very deep conversations about how to ensure that privacy is protected. In Los Angeles, we have very rigorous data privacy principles that today, actually, we've put into our ordinance, right? So any violation of those data privacy principles, would be in violation of the code that actually mandates our ability to access that information. I also think that, 3.5, almost 4 years later from when we launched the mobility data specification, sort of the proof is in the pudding, right? That data has not been a victim, not to say that it could never happen, but it has not been victim to a lot of the situations that we've seen private data be subject to as well. So I do think that we need to have a conversation about the access of data and what it is being used for. And do we want to allow cities to, at the very least, be on a level playing field with the private companies that are directly benefiting from the public assets that we're actually tasked with protecting.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and to that I would add that we want to have a regulatory and a partnership relationship with companies like DoorDash, Uber Eats, any of these network companies. We don't want to have a relationship with the personal information of the individual DoorDashers.
Right.
I think keeping that information at the edge, stripping the PII, and using all the data standards we've developed to make sure that cities have what we need to plan and regulate and both hold accountable and reward companies that do a good job. But we don't want to know. We don't want to know who's driving that DoorDash labeled vehicle. We want to know that the system is working and we want to optimize around that system.
And one other point too, I think when it comes to mobility data, we actually have very little, if any, access to PII. And there are lots of legacy services that as cities we already provide, where we actually do have access to all of your information, name, address, social security. So I think it's really important to remember that cities have been tasked with accessing your data for quite some time. And what we're looking to access today is actually far less invasive
Yeah.
or has the capacity to identify an individual. That said, that does not mean that we don't have to prioritize the privacy and as Tom underlined, is something that is top of mind for all of us.
Would you say that this technology is being more now used to look at companies rather than individuals than it was 5 years ago? That this is no longer a question of, individuals parking somewhere, but the company policies of Uber or Lyft or Amazon about where they park and kind of having communication with those business leaders. And
Speaking for Los Angeles, but I'm going to venture to guess Tom's going to piggyback on that. It was never about an individual. For us, we're having this conversation on mobility data because of the overwhelming influx of fleets of vehicles, right? And that have fundamentally shifted the way we do business. I mean, let's think about where we started this conversation, right? I mean, sure, buses are a part of the curb demand, but what is really making this such a hot commodity is the fleets of vehicles that we now have to manage that 10, 12 years ago, before the advent of TNCs, wasn't there. So it has always been about companies. It has always been about really trying to optimize the real estate that we have to protect some of those greater good uses that are so important to us and how we function as cities.
Yeah, and I think if you think about the way we interact with a typical Uber driver, we give them a lot of parking tickets, and the driver pays that parking ticket. I would much rather move upstream and work with Uber and all the other companies to optimize the use of the space, and that can only be done at the network level. But what is happening now is, in some ways, the public-facing driver or the individual is getting all the disbenefit. They're getting the parking tickets, they're getting the problems of congestion, and not reaping the benefits of a much better designed system. And we can design that together.
Yeah, and I would just add to, all of the cities that we work with, it's not about, better understanding what these companies are doing to regulate them in a way that doesn't make sense for them. They're going to operate regardless. It's how can we accommodate them to solve our common goals again, right? And so it's always about just understanding what's actually happening, putting it into buckets to understand behavior, what their needs are, and then how can we create a system that works for everybody.
I can go on these topics or listen to you guys talk about these topics for basically all day, and I have a ton more questions, but I think we're unfortunately a little bit close on time, so I want to sort of close out with a question of what would your ideal city of the future look like? Los Angeles, San Francisco, anywhere really, and what systems are implemented to get us there? And if you feel like it, what kind of timeline would you say would you give yourself to create this city of the future?
Well, I think for Los Angeles, I think one of the things that's really important to honor is that we are a collection of neighborhoods in LA. And so what works for Boyle Heights may not work for Woodland Hills, and what works for San Pedro may not work for Sylmar, and everywhere in between, right? And I am intentionally picking communities that are not just at the core of downtown, which is its own entity in and of itself, right? So I think for me, it's how do I honor each of those neighborhood needs? How do I really dig in and understand what their travel patterns are, what their demands for goods and services are, and how do we meet those? It's an inherent quality that exists in LA. It is what has made it challenging, actually, to create the kind of mass transit that other cities like San Francisco have access to. But I think with the sort of infrastructure that Metro is really bringing, with the incredible expansion of light rail that we're seeing, we really do have the capacity now to connect those neighborhoods and also uniquely give assets to each of them as well. How do we get there? I think we've spoken a lot about the solution-oriented partnership that we're looking for. I think it is crystal clear. As cities, we absolutely don't get there without having access to the kinds of technology and data that we need to be on a level playing field with our private sector partners. But I think that we're already seeing some really exciting signs of promise. And so, time frame, I think that the time to strike is now. We actually can't afford to give ourselves sort of a long runway. We have to keep testing, piloting, and then scaling from there. And that's sort of what we're looking forward to here in LA.
As an Angelino, that sounds pretty good to me.
Yeah.
I would, yeah, I mean, a lot of what you hit on, I would definitely echo. I would add as well, for us, and to your point, every neighborhood's different, every city is different, but having the adaptable policy frameworks and funding frameworks so that cities can move a little bit more nimbly, I think would be incredibly advantageous to everybody to implement more technologies and solutions to the benefit of all constituents. But for us, I mean, we envision a future of a lot more automation and autonomous activities as it relates to, obviously what we do, curb management, but also transit, as well as, other solutions that help everybody get a little bit more connected to their neighborhoods and surrounding communities. But a lot of great things happening here in LA that I'm looking forward to seeing become that city of the future here in the next few years.
So my ideal future puts people first and not cars first. I mean, it's simple as that, right? And so it's all about incentives, right? We are all people who are driven by our own incentives. And if we give an incentive to drive, we're going to drive, right? If we build an incentive to walk or take public transit, we'll do that. And right now, it's not even close to an even playing field. And I think the way to get there is to look at the externalities that private industry is not paying for. Macro-wise, we talk about carbon credits to kind of create some sort of calculation for externalities. But the way I look at it on the city level, it's about that curb. The curb is the flashpoint. And as I started this talk with, it's all about supply-demand mismatch. The supply is finite, the demand is growing, cities own the supply, so let's assert that. And let's use that to our advantage to create incentives so that it does become a win-win for everyone with a carrot approach.
Yeah, all those are great comments. I agree with all of that, and I think the thing we could be doing now is setting up systems and standards and structures so that cities can continue to evolve. The answer to the ideal city is that it's not about the way it looks, or it's never done. San Francisco's been changing since 1849. It'll keep changing for another 150 years. LA is the same way. But we care about outcomes, good outcomes around social equity and greenhouse gas reduction and safety in our streets. And if we're building structures and creating incentives and making progress towards those things, I think that's what an ideal path towards the future looks like.
Well, I think we're all looking forward to getting there pretty soon. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut off the applause. Sure. I'm not sure if we're doing time for Q&A. Let me see if anyone's... Nope. Okay. Sure.
Hi, my name is Nav, and I'm leading a research project at UC Berkeley with Dr. Alexander, who's a professor emeritus at the Department of Transportation. I have two questions. My first question is, so we are working with a solution where we are using on-ground sensors and live satellite feed to detect available yellow curbs and the location of yellow curbs. So we've been working on this past 2 years. We have interviewed 200 plus commercial drivers, found out their pain points. So my question is, one is, what are the cities doing to at least reduce the bureaucratic delays in implementation of new ideas? And second question is, all these commercial drivers we interviewed, their biggest pain point was scarcity of the yellow curbs. Even if they have a yellow curb, they will not park there because their destination is pretty far and they don't want to waste time back and forth. So is hybrid curbs what city is looking for? So two questions, the bureaucracy, the delays, and the scarcity of yellow curbs.
I can take a shot at the hybrid curb question. I agree that there's something kind of funny in the California Vehicle Code that your curb is either white or yellow. It's this binary thing. You load goods or people, completely not suited to the way people travel today. So we've actually have developed this hybrid loading zone. We call it a general loading zone in San Francisco that has essentially legalized door dashing and things like that, making commercial deliveries in a passenger car or dropping off passengers in a non-passenger car. There's a lot of, I mean, that's just the low-hanging fruit. There's a lot more to be done here. I do agree that there are a lot of archaic things in the state vehicle code and in our city transportation codes that need to be fixed.
And I think as far as the bureaucratic challenges, not to sound like a broken record, but I think the the beauty of, for example, what we do at the Open Mobility Foundation when we work directly with private sector partners is we are able to have the conversations and create the infrastructure, the digital infrastructure we need to then be able to pilot something and test it, which often allows us to sort of expedite a solution and test it before we have to scale it, which is usually where then we have to, end up with a a more thoughtful approach, to a RFP, for example, of a citywide service. So, and I do think that, as we face sort of the pressures here, right, where tech just moves at a pace that city bureaucracies weren't designed to meet, it is in this space of partnership that we're going to be able to expand and serve mutual goals.
That was so great, guys. Again, I could talk to you, I feel like forever about the city of the future, but I want to say thank you to Connie, to Jordan, to Jean, and to Tom. I'm not sure exactly who the next speaker is, but I'm sure they will come up here shortly, and continue to enjoy your day at Curbivore. Thank you.